Okay, so left off last class thinking about the supply curve, and a little rushed at the end, but it was the same idea as we had with demand, where if we want overall market supply, what we really be doing is adding up the supply of each producer or seller. Once we add those all up at every single price, what those quantities are, we would get what kind of the market quantity supply would be. Right? So once we have the market quantity supplied, right, it's just taking those points, right, all those different prices and the total market supply, the quantity supplied to the market at each one of those prices, kind of plotting those points, right? And we're going to keep everything linear in this class. We could draw a line through them, and now we've got our kind of market supply curve. Right? So at every given price, how much total in the economy is being supplied in the market? So we said supply is upward sloping, right? Reflecting that as prices go up, more and more people are willing to produce and sell that good, right? So you got to think about another reason as to why that law would be upheld. Let's say I have a bunch of manufacturing equipment. Maybe I'm like a tool and die shop or something. If the price of, say, automobiles starts going up quite a bit, more than, I don't know, even the price of a plane, right? I might switch my production to start producing parts for automobiles as opposed to planes, right? So anytime I would have any type of machinery or capital that could be used in the production of multiple goods, well, as one good gets more expensive, I'm more likely, or at least there are some companies that will be more likely to switch their production to other types of materials, right? You can see this play out over time. A pretty relevant example is Ball, Corporation, right? Started out making the ball jars, and well, they now I think they'll make some stuff for space, and then they also do light bulbs. They don't have anything to do jars anymore, right? So over time, they use their capital, their resources to start producing other goods that they could get, could produce, and that those goods had a higher price than what they currently would make. So that's kind of the idea behind the market supply curve. We also said that the supply curve reflects marginal costs, right? Just like the demand curve reflected marginal benefits. Supply curve is going to reflect the marginal cost of each unit. So if I go to that 15th unit, the marginal cost of providing that 15th unit would be $3. Because I'll provide a unit up to the point where the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. Well, for producers, the marginal benefit is the price, right? That $3. So for every unit below 15 and below, it must be that the marginal cost was below the marginal benefit, right? They were receiving $3 when they sold this good. At any quantity, if we go to that 16th unit, well, at $3, we no longer will supply that 16th unit, which reflects that 16th unit must have a marginal cost that's greater than $3. Therefore, if I produced it, it would cost me more than it I could get by selling it. Right? So why would I produce it? I wouldn't, and I stay at that 15. So that supply curve reflects our marginal cost to us. So you're supposed to watch this video before class. It was posted on YouTube. I put up a reminder announcement even yesterday with a link. So I'm expecting that you watched it. We'll have some questions. We'll probably get to see this is how easy they would be. But the video contained information on which of the following, right? What was it covered? Demand shifts, supply shifts, identifying equilibriums, or stock prices. And last class, if those of you had the mobile app, you're having issues, if there's multiple classes showing up, it should be the very bottom class. I think there was only one showing up today, but if there are multiple ones, it's that bottom. So how many classes are showing up to you? Are there multiple ones that are showing up? So choose the lowest one, the bottom one. yet or no? Fall. The ECON 201 fall 2021. That working? Okay. Anybody else having issues with it? All right, so we should be good to go. Everybody make sure you get a response in. We're okay. So 33 of us here. All right, so this one should have been pretty easy. What did they go over? Yeah, supply shifts, right? So, I mean, part of this is like we haven't covered that yet. It's probably the logical next thing we're going to do. We went through demand shifts. We talked about supply. Now, okay, the next thing is going to be supply shifts. So this one, can I get an idea if you paid a little bit of attention to the video, right? Let's say I just want you to identify which of these, A, B, or C, is evidence of a supply increase, right? So what does a supply curve increase look like, right? Which one of these three? So I'll give you about 30 seconds or so on this one. It shouldn't be too bad. But I wanted a supply curve increase, an increase in supply. Not an increase in quantity supply, but an increase in the entire supply curve. Might help a little bit. All right, everybody got an answer in? I'm gonna close it out. All right, so which of these should be your supply curve increase? I'm not sure. So an example I actually did in the video. But if we think about, we've got some supply curve, right? Now it's kind of right equals marginal cost. Remember, it reflects marginal cost. A supply curve increase, kind of like demand increases, means that at any given price, right, there's now a higher quantity willing to be supplied. So at any given price, so we could choose this price, quantity supplied is going to be, actually, use a different color. Quantity supplied after a supply increase would be, let's hope this color works better. There you go. Right? A higher quantity supplied. Up here at this price, an increase in the quantity supplied, now it's out here. Right? And I would have that at every single price so that my new supply curve, or this increase in my supply curve, is like a shift to the right. Okay? So it's a little bit different. I think demand is a little bit easier to think about shifts because being a downward sloping curve, a shift like up is an increase in demand. Here for supply, it doesn't look like it's a shift up, right? I mean, supply is increasing here. It just visually doesn't look like that in the graph. So the way to think about it more so is think about at every given price, what has happened in quantity supply, right? And all that gets pushed to the right here, right? It's increased. Whereas a decrease in supply, so I don't know, was that A over there? Right, we kind of see this rightward shift, this increase in supply. Same kind of thing can happen if we have a decrease in supply at every given price, right? We would just have a lower quantity supplied. And so let's go with this green there. All that S2. Right? So this is like a decrease in supply, so that every given price, quantity supplied has went down. But it gets a little bit tricky with supply shifts because this is a supply decrease, but it like looks like supply is going like shifting up, right? So don't think about it as shifting up. It's a supply decrease because the supply curve is really shifting to the left, right? So this decrease is a shift to the left. A supply increase looks like a shift to the right. Question? So I think that's and hopefully these aren't too terribly tough. I guess I'll look at them after class and see how many of us got it right. But just watching like those small little videos, I'm not asking you to walk away with like the perfect understanding of the concepts, but kind of maybe a simple like question like this was the main point of the video, thinking about supply shifts, increases or decreases. There you go. So we've got a lot of things that could shift the supply curve. So there's a lot of things that could shift the supply curve. The supply curve itself represents the relationship between the price of that good and the quantity supplied of that good. So changes in the price of that good just shift where we're at along the supply curve, right? Changes in the price of the good we're looking at changes the quantity supplied of that good, which is just means you're just moving along that supply curve. All these other things that we're going to hold constant in order to understand that relationship between the price and the quantity supplied of the good. Well, some of those things can change, right? And if they increase supply, it looks like a shift to the right. If they decrease supply, this is where we said it kind of looks like this leftward shift, right? So here's kind of a, breaking them up, right? Let's say I have a supply increase. This was kind of pushing a going from green to blue, pushing my supply curve to the right. And then if I had a supply decrease, it looks like it kind of shifts to the left. Right? So this kind of summarizes what's here. Any questions at this point? Because I'm going to start talking about things that actually cause these shifts. I want to make sure we're at least okay with why the supply shift looks like this right now. Also, when I use those videos, I'm also assuming that you've watched them and that it's almost like getting a little bit of the lecture out ahead of time. So that's why I'm not spend as much time on these shifts because I've kind of already went through it. All right. So this is one of the, it kind of related to this, or talk about this in the example, but let's think about the first thing that we'll think about that can shift the supply curve. So we've got input prices. So this is our original supply curve. Then let's say that, I don't know, what we got, we're having an example, how long? So let's say input prices go down. Okay? So we'll start out with what happens if input prices go down. We'll think about this way. Input prices are things like material costs, right? Or labor costs. So let's say that labor becomes relatively cheaper. Or if I'm building houses, this is a good example. Because lumber's skyrocketing right now. If I'm what's something that's good cheap? Oh, so anything where we've got advancements in technology that make things cheaper, right? So maybe now it's cheaper to produce, smart cars or electric cars because the technology electronically is gone, has skyrocketed. So whatever the reason, whatever my inputs are, if they become cheaper, I now can produce the same quantity of a good at a lower cost, right? Okay, so I'll give you this example. Let's say I'm in a factory and I need my workers to produce 10 units of some good, right? But I'm paying them $20 an hour, right? Well, if all of a sudden I only have to pay them 10, they haven't become any more or less efficient. They can still produce those 10 units the same amount of time, but I have to pay them half as much, right? So I can produce the same quantity, but at a lower cost, right? I don't have to pay my labor as much. So that idea is that I can produce the same quantity, but I have price up here on the y-axis, but price is just reflecting dollars. So we're thinking about the cost, right? Cost in terms of dollars. But that same quantity, my cost of producing it has went down. And that's true no matter what quantity I'm producing at, right? The cost has went down. So we're going to end up with kind of this increase in supply if input prices go down. If it's relatively now cheaper to produce something, I can produce the same number of units at a lower cost, right? No matter what number of units I want to produce, it now costs me less because labor costs fell in half. Right? In my example, I'm using labor costs. It could be the cost of materials as well, zinc or plastics or whatever. So we've got a decrease in input prices. is actually going to increase our supply curve. And then the exact opposite holds, right? If input prices become more expensive, right? So now it's going to be that, let's say labor, like this is probably the more realistic one. Let's say that I'm producing some good, and all of a sudden, minimum wages increase, right? So I was paying my workers minimum wage before, the government comes in, increases minimum wage up to $15 an hour. Now I've got to, that increases my input prices, right? One of my major inputs is labor. So to produce the exact same quantity, now I'm going to have to pay those workers more money, right? So my marginal cost to produce that same quantity is higher, and that's true no matter what quantity I'm producing. So if my input prices go up, I kind of get this decrease in supply. So I guess you want to write this out, right? It's just the exact opposite. So we had an increase in input prices. I'll get out of the way here in a second. We'd have a decrease in supply. Okay. Questions on that? And I think that these shifts are easier to think about, like the input prices. If we remember, like marginal costs are really just reflecting how much it costs me to produce that good. Well, part of that cost is going to be my inputs, right? Labor, materials, or whatever it takes to produce that. So we've got some examples, right? We saw sugar price increase, right? That's going to decrease the supply of candy, right? Because it takes sugar to produce candy. This is a stupid example, but this is the idea, right? You think about if the cost of milk went down, in that example we were using of Zoolander's orange milk and frappuccinos, right? Decreasing the cost of milk means that supply would increase for those, right? Because one of the inputs is milk. Another good example right now, if you look at the real estate market, new home prices, like to have someone build you a new home, have went up quite a bit. I mean, real estate prices on a whole lot went up quite a bit. But even if you have a home where you build from scratch, because lumber prices have gone up a lot, like a lot, right? So input price increases in lumber have caused there to be a smaller supply of kind of brand new homes in the market, right? What are some other ones? So if you're looking at new car prices, they're quite a bit high right now. So the input prices for those chips that they don't have, they're scrambling to produce those, but at higher cost, right? That's going to drive up the prices of, that increase in the input price is going to drive down kind of the supply of new cars. So if you go to some of these lots, and then minimum wage, I have already used this example, right? You increase the minimum wage, you increase labor costs, that's an input price, you're going to see this decrease in my supply curve. All right, any questions on any of that? Kind of the one that really a lot of the other shifts we'll talk about in supply all kind of hinge on this idea of input prices. So we won't went through these, it's just another graph you kind of have in the slides. It's basically what I did on the board, showing this supply increase. So one of the things that isn't a direct change to input prices, but it's the same idea, is if I see technology improvements, right? So technology improvements can cause increases or decreases in input prices. Right? As technology improves, maybe I don't need as many materials as I did before because there's less waste, right? In whatever my production process is. Technology improvements may allow me to, instead of have to pay these higher labor costs, I can switch over to some machinery that if I look across my units is actually a little bit cheaper than what I would have used labor, right? So this is the idea of like replacing, people at the register with a electronic kiosk, right? Yeah, the kiosk might have cost me a little more upfront, but over the long run, like I'm not paying these high labor costs. Once I've got the machine, people can just punch in, their order on this electronic screen. So with technology, right, we really only have examples where input prices go down, right? Any technology improvement is just going to make things better or make things relatively cheaper. So if input prices go down, my marginal costs are now lower, so I would be willing to supply more to the market. Another way to think about this, at the same price, when I see a supply increase, I'm willing to supply more to the market. Right? So technology improvements drive down input prices, which increases our supply curve. Right? So it's kind of like it's not directly a change to input prices, but it's like an indirect, right? Because of this technology advancement, our input prices change. Now, we almost never see like a development in technology, so it's not really that interesting to talk about. Like, well, what happens if we go back to the Stone Age? Well, yeah, now costs go back up, and so we see some things change there. But really, we only see technology advancements. It's the only one that's kind of worth thinking about. And then, yes, I love technology. If you haven't seen this at the end of Napoleon Dynamite, then I feel bad for you. So you should watch that movie if you haven't. It's a great one. Another thing that we can talk about that influences the supply curve, this one's pretty easy, is going to be the number of sellers or the number of producers. So we have this with demand, where the number of consumers influence our supply curve. But I'll kind of give you a visual as to why this can hold up, right? So let's say I have I've got individual producers. Maybe these are companies, however you want to think about this. And they each have, call this X1, 2, and 3. Right? They each are going to have their own supply curve. Well, the way we got market supply, call this the market supply. The way that we got the quantity supplied for our market supply curve was just adding up the quantity supplied from every individual within our economy, or every individual company in our economy. Well, if I add another producer of this good, right? Well, now I've got this plus this plus this plus this much, right? So adding more suppliers or more producers or more sellers to my economy is just going to cause that supply curve to increase, right? Just adding more people. So at any given price, there's now more supply to the market. I'm adding more companies at any given price. I've got the same companies I had before, plus a new one. I'm just going to have more on the market at any given price. And the reason behind that is really like to get market supply, we're adding up each individual supply group. So this one's a little bit different than when we were thinking about consumers, only because, really with demand, it's like if you add, I think it's a little more intuitive to think about if you add more people to your country, obviously you're going to need more, food, you're going to need more water, housing, things like that. Now there's some goods that may not be impacted, right? Like our luxury goods, like you can't just add a person and expect that more, I don't know, Lamborghinis are going to be sold. No, right? You need like a certain type of consumer to be added to your economy. But with supply, it's not like we're not adding citizens or civilians. Really, we're adding companies, right? Or producers, or some type of individual who's willing to sell or produce this product. So it's not just like adding more people to the country, it's adding more companies. Right? Oops. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay, so I've got expectations up here. We'll come back to the market expectations. This one's like, once we do the price ones, I think we'll do it easier. So let's say we've got a market that we're interested in. And put quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis, and my supply curve, which reflects marginal costs. And now let's think about if expected prices are higher. So if future prices are expected to be higher than today, so future prices are expected to be higher than today, as a producer or a seller, what do you think I might want to do? If I know that I could sell the good that I have produced today, or I could sell it tomorrow for an expected higher price, hold back my supply until tomorrow, right? So if I expect there to be higher prices in the future, today, at any given price, we're going to see that people are willing to sell fewer. or there's going to be a decrease in the quantity supplied. So at any given price. So we've got for this decrease in supply. Oops, I'll draw an arrow here. Or this leftward shift. Right? If we expect prices to be higher in the future today, we're going to hold off, or sorry, if we expect prices to be higher in the future, we're going to hold off on selling them today and try to hold on to them tomorrow. Okay? So we see a decrease in current supply. What if I'm so notes here. Now I'll use this idea of right decrease in current supply or decrease in the supply now. But what if I expect prices to be lower in the future? Right? So I think that whatever good I'm producing, I'm gonna be able to sell it for less money tomorrow. I'm gonna try to sell all of it today, right? And so we're gonna expect then to see current supply actually increase if we expect prices to be lower tomorrow. So, right, remember that a supply increase would look something like this, right? A shift to the right. Questions on that? I think it's fairly intuitive. I think the only tricky thing here is in our everyday lives, we are generally all consumers, right? So it's easier for us to like intuitively think about the demand curve because we literally make purchase decisions every single day. Here, now that we're thinking about supply, we have to think about what is benefiting someone who is selling that good, not purchasing. So here, higher prices are actually a good thing, right? So if prices are going to be higher tomorrow, I want to sell tomorrow and like hold off and not sell as much today. So it's kind of, you know, whenever we're talking about supply, we always have to start to think about not through a lens that's like common every day to us, but think about it through like a company standpoint, someone who's trying to sell you a product. Any questions on this? No? Okay. So I've got kind of a summary, and there's some things that we didn't talk about in here, but these are all kind of different things that could change. So the number of sellers, input prices, expected prices. The one we didn't talk about are taxes and subsidies. I usually hold off on this discussion. We'll do a couple more IQ questions, then we might talk about kind of what it would look like if we have taxes. So we talked about a few things that could change kind of supply or shift supply. So if I'm thinking about the supply curve for pizza, right? What happens, which of these would be the correct shift or movement along the supply curve if I saw the price of pepperoni rise? So if I'm thinking about the price of pepperoni pizza, what happens to the supply curve for that pizza if the price of pepperonis increase, right? So here we can think about pepperonis as being kind of an input, and we're seeing an increase in input prices, right? We're seeing that input that I need to produce my product, right? I'm gonna see a price increase. What's that gonna do to supply curve for my product? So remember, supply curve reflects marginal costs. I've now seen my input prices rise. What happens to my supply curve? I'll give you another 15 seconds here. Actually, I think, were there 33 of us? I think we got everyone already in. If you haven't gotten an answer in, take your best guess now, close it out at this minute mark. All right, I'm gonna close it out. So what should this answer be? B, right? Because I've seen input prices go up, right? That means to provide the exact same quantity of a good, I should just leave these markers over. Provide the exact same quantity of a good, look at my supply curve. Whatever quantity I want to look at, it now costs me more to provide that same quantity. If I want to make the same number of pizzas with pepperoni on them, it now costs me a little bit more to make that same number of pizzas. And so my costs are going to be higher. And it doesn't matter what quantity I'm producing, my costs would be higher at every single quantity. So I'm going to kind of see this decrease in supply or this leftward shift. This is, I always kind of use this as a little like tick to kind of notate what the supply curve is or the demand curve is after the change. Okay. Any questions on that? All right, so we already got 3 questions in here. I want to make sure I get a good number of base points in. So we'll kind of walk through these together. What if we saw the number of Papa John's increase, right? So the number of producers increases. So what should happen to supply? Yeah, increases, which would look like a shift to the right. I guess like one way to think about it, and I'm trying to do good at, sometimes I draw them on an angle and then I try to remember that when you don't know it at first, it's easier to think about. Drawing the arrows to the left and right for supply, because here, if I'm moving to the right, think about it as a supply increase because I'm moving away from that 0 point, right? Whereas if I see a leftward shift in supply, that should represent a decrease because I'm moving closer to this like quantity of 0 point. So I try to remember when I'm doing this on the board to draw, I remember there, well, I remember here, and then sometimes I forget and like just draw the arrow and like the way that it's moving, but right, it's a little bit easier to think about a decrease is when it's going to the left because it's getting closer to that 0 point, and then an increase is moving to the right because it's getting further away. So that one shouldn't be too bad. What if I see a change in the price of pizza? What happens to the supply curve? Remember, if the price of the good we're looking at changes, we're just moving to a different point along the supply curve. All other things held constant, these other things that could change, those haven't changed. So we're still just looking at that relationship between the price and the quantity supplied of that good. When we see things like input prices or all these other things, price expectations change, that's when we start to see shifts. So the one I skipped over, that's kind of interesting. It's just like, I don't like to go through it too much in class, and I don't use a lot of examples unless they're very obvious, is market expectations. So this usually like requires that you have some industry specific knowledge, right? Or some knowledge about, you know, what's going to happen in this specific industry. So for instance, if I think that it's going to be a really cold winter, right? And that people are going to need to use a lot of natural gas, I might hold off and not supply it today and wait to supply in the future because I know that people are going to want it more, right? The demand is going to be higher. So those, like I said, I don't use a lot of examples with market expectations because you have to know something about the market of whatever good you're talking about. Now, the ones that I might use, right, is something like weather, like, you know, if I know it's going to be an unseasonably warm summer, right, I might hold off on, I don't know, my water supply or something prior, you know, before or after, or if I'm, you know, selling, you know, I don't know, swim products, right? I might hold off on them until kind of then. So I don't like to use those a whole lot. But the price expectation ones are fair game. And this does influence supply curves quite a bit when we look at the data. So we went through these clicker questions. Where are we at in time? I'll do the taxes, I think now, and then we'll talk about each of those. So I don't have a slide for this. But let's think about 2 other changes. So first we'll do taxes, and then I'll do one other thing that I could give you an example of that's not in the slide that I think is going to make fair game. So we'll price up here on our y-axis, quantity on the x-axis, we've got supply. So can anybody guess? Let's say this is could be gasoline, or at this point, could be a tobacco product maybe, but they all of a sudden increase the tax on. right? So every unit purchased is now going to have this added tax. Right? This is what they do to tobacco and gasoline and things. What do you think would happen to my supply curve if taxes on that good went up? Yeah. So let's think about what a tax would do to a good. If I'm producing the same number of goods, but now as the producer of that good, I have to pay a tax for each unit I produce. What's happened to my costs? My costs have went up. So just like technology, taxes is just an indirect effect on input prices, right? Because if I see that taxes increase, what that's really telling me is that my input prices have increased, which if my prices have increased, at any quantity, my marginal cost is now higher. I actually see this decrease in supply. I did what I just said I should. There we go. Yeah. So taxes are really just an indirect effect on input prices. And so anytime we see something taxed, we see that producers or sellers are less willing to provide that to the market. It's now going to cost them more. They've got the same input prices before, and now they have to pay this additional tax. So, if you really want to drive producers out of the market, you increase the tax enough, right? You can really get that supply curve pretty much be zero. You can also do subsidies, right? So with a subsidy, well, I'll draw it with a different color. I'll do it on the same graph, just kind of say this. So let's say I have a subsidy. Right? So we'll talk a little more specific about them when we get to talk about surplus. But a subsidy is something the government pays to a company or producer to produce a good. So the example I always use, because I think what they were doing at one point in time, it was like 10,000 a pop, I think. But if you ever drive, what's the nearest one here? When I went to Purdue for grad school, my family was in Michigan, so I drive up 421, and it was just like cornfields, But then there was this one couple farms that like sold out and had windmills all over the place, right? And it's because the government was paying them like $10,000 for every windmill that they could put up on their farm, right? So they were getting a subsidy to produce these. So for every windmill I construct, the government will pay me $10,000. So you can kind of think about what that does is, if it had previously cost me $100,000 to put up this windmill, if the government's now going to give me a $10,000 subsidy, now how much does it cost me? 90, right? It actually decreases my costs. So anytime that I see the government comes in and says, you know what, we're going to give you a bunch of subsidies, so we'll increase the amount of the subsidy we're going to give you. It's actually like, it's kind of the exact opposite effect of taxes. It actually decreases my input prices. Actually, before you take the notes, I drew it up here, right? Taxes decrease supply, whereas subsidies are then going to, well, input prices are lower now at every given quantity. So at any given quantity, my prices are now lower. Right, I'm going to end up with a subsidy, or sorry, this supply plus this subsidy, right? So it's like I'm seeing this increase in supply if the government gives subsidies. That makes sense? Yeah.
Could this have like a backfire effect? Let's say there was like a huge flood in the market, there was a subsidy, and then more supply,
So,
expensive.
I think what you're asking is if I had subsidies high enough to where my supply curve shifts a lot, so there's a lot willing to be supplied in the market, could it backfire? In the current, as you're currently giving that subsidy, it wouldn't backfire. But you can imagine, like, for society, there's definitely a point at which the benefit to society from having more of these isn't greater than the subsidy amount being given. Now, would I say the government has ever done that? I would probably find a million different situations where, yeah, if you look at society overall, it might drive supply up to a point where the last few units supplied really aren't benefiting society more than what it's costing society in terms of tax dollars, right? Yeah. But in terms of like overflowing the market, we'll get to this next week, but it could have some weird effects on equilibrium prices and equilibrium quantities provided to the market. So this is just like, think about it this way. Up to this point, we've only ever talked about like what people would be willing to supply. Right? You can imagine like if you know, whatever good this was, if the price was high enough, well, then producers want to supply millions of that unit to the market. Well, they only want to do that if there's enough people who also demand that product. So we're kind of actually leading into like the next thing, which would be determining what the equilibrium on that market is. Any other questions related to kind of that taxes or subsidies? Okay with this? Okay, so I think we're good with that. So how do we determine what the price of a good ends up being, right? The supply and the demand curve really just tell me, well, how much would people be willing to buy? How much would producers be willing to provide to the market at different given prices? But what does the end up, what does the price end up being? Right? And also not just what does the price end up being in the market, but how many units are produced and then consumed in that market as well. Okay? So the easiest way to think about this is equilibrium is just going to be where that supply and demand curve intersect. Okay? I'm going to think about why in a second, but that's the easiest way to think about identifying that equilibrium point. Okay? So the equilibrium price is going to be where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are exactly the same. So I'm trying to draw this out. Give you a nice little visual to think about this. We've got quantity, got price. Notice the x-axis, x and y-axis were the same for both our demand and our supply curve. So the way I typically write this out is I not only just label them supply and demand, but I label them this way to remind myself demand reflects marginal benefits, supply reflects marginal costs. So the equilibrium point is where these two intersect. So typically we'll kind of call this Q star for the equilibrium quantity, and then P star represents the equilibrium price. The reason why that's the equilibrium is because at this price, there is the exact same quantity supplied, right? Remember the supply curve tells us the quantity supplied at that price, and the quantity demanded at that price is exactly the same, right? Or the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded is exactly the same. And the reason why we stop at that point, well, think about it. For a consumer, this, whatever quantity this happens to be, the marginal benefit to the consumer is greater than, the marginal benefit to the consumer is greater than the marginal cost of the producer to provide it. Right? So, that consumer is definitely going to want that good, right? And the cost is below what they're going to benefit them. So do they purchase another unit? Well, the marginal benefit would still be above the marginal cost here. The marginal benefit and the marginal cost would be equal to each other where those two intersect. But then would I go one quantity past that? Well, now the marginal cost, which remember, the producer would have to at least get whatever their marginal cost is to provide the good. Because if they're receiving anything less than that, well, they're just losing money, right? It's costing them more than the price they're receiving if they get any value below wherever they're at in the supply curve. So if I move past this point where the supply and demand curve intersect, producers are like, yeah, I need at least this price to sell the good. And consumers say, well, I'm only willing to pay up to my marginal benefit, which is well below what the producer's kind of minimum price they'd be willing to accept is. And so we never see these units producer consume. Right, like in this range, you can kind of imagine at any one of these quantities, at least there's some wiggle room for either side, because the producer here is saying, I need at least this price. And the consumer say, well, I'm willing to pay up to this price. Well, there's a lot of negotiation. We can come to a price that works for both of us in that range. Now, so we can continue, right? If there's, this is a perfectly competitive market, so there, we try to have that negotiation. There's always going to be someone that says, well, I'll offer you a slightly lower, lower price to the consumer. And so we see that additional units keep being consumed up to the point where the price that the seller is willing to take is exactly the same as the price that the consumer is willing to pay. So that's our equilibrium point. That's how we identify it. It's kind of the reasoning as behind why. It really goes back to like cost benefit. It goes back to the marginal benefit of that last unit is exactly the same as the marginal cost. So, I've got, an example of the slides here. If you're going back, I like to do a lot of this stuff on the board, even if I know it's in the slides. So you can see here, you can pretty easily identify the point at which these supply and demand curves intersect, 15 units, and $3 would be our equilibrium price. Okay. How would we get this if we didn't have this nice visual graph? Well, really all we're doing here is taking our market demand and taking our market supply, right? We could like put these schedules on the same thing, right? Our market supply schedule and our market demand schedule was the quantity demand and the quantity supply at different price levels. So if I don't have the graph and I just have this schedule, I can go through and at $0, I can see that there's way more demand than what's being supplied, which makes sense. The price is 0. Consumers want to purchase a lot, but if I'm selling that good, I'm not good. My cost would have to be 0 in order for me to produce it. Then at $1, there's a few people that want to produce that good and will sell it. Demand falls a little bit. We continue on down. We look at that price of $3. Well, that's where quantity supply and quantity demand are exactly the same, right? So we don't have a shortage, right? Kind of think about here when we had quantity demanded that was greater than quantity supplied, there wasn't enough of the good on the market to satisfy demand. We don't have a surplus where the amount produced on the market is greater than whatever demand is. We're in equilibrium when the amount demanded is exactly the same as the amount being supplied. So for us here, that would be at a price of $3, and that equilibrium quantity ends up being 15. Yeah, so we identified the equilibrium price, and we already talked about whatever the quantity is at that price, that would be our equilibrium quantity. So we're going to end the discussion there. We're definitely going to talk way more about equilibrium next week, but it won't be on Monday, because Monday is Labor Day. So on Wednesday, right, we'll meet in class and we'll pick up on this equilibrium discussion. I'll also be putting up another pre-class video. So I expect that you would have watched that before we start class on Wednesday. Okay, it's going to be a little bit more about equilibrium and supply shifts. Okay.